For years, the world had no idea what was happening behind the barbed wire of the Soviet Union. Millions of people were sent to frozen wastelands and forced to work until they died. It was a nightmare hidden in silence, until the truth finally broke through, and the scale of Joseph Stalin's terror could no longer be denied. When Stalin took full control of the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, fear became a tool of government. It was quiet at first. Arrests happened at night. Officially, these people were enemies of the state. In reality, many were just innocent citizens and even loyal party members. By 1930, Stalin had approved the rapid expansion of forced labor camps. They were not called gulags at first. That word came from an acronym used by the Soviet secret police. It stood for Main Administration of Camps. On paper, these camps were meant to reform criminals through labor. In reality, they became a system of punishment. The camps were spread across the entire Soviet Union. From the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Kazakhstan, they appeared wherever there was land to exploit. Prisoners were sent to cut trees, mine coal, dig canals, build railroads, and construct entire cities from nothing. Survival was never guaranteed. Most of the world had no idea what was happening. The Soviet Union was closed off. Foreign journalists were controlled. Travel was restricted. And those who escaped rarely made it far enough to tell their story. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin pushed the Soviet Union into one of its darkest periods. That time became known as the Great Terror. It was not spontaneous violence. It was directed from the top. Orders were sent down through the system, and fear spread fast. The arrests were carried out by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Officers were not told to investigate crimes. They were given numbers. Each region received arrest quotas, sometimes broken down even further into how many people were to be sent to labor camps and how many were to be executed. These numbers had to be met. If local officers failed, they risked becoming targets themselves. This created pressure to arrest anyone who could be accused, whether there was evidence or not. People were taken for reasons that would normally mean nothing. A joke told years earlier could be reported as disloyalty. Complaining about food shortages could be labeled sabotage. Writing to a relative abroad raised suspicion. Knowing someone who had already been arrested was enough to put a person on a list. Many accusations came from neighbors, co-workers, or even friends trying to protect themselves. Once arrested, most people had no real chance to defend themselves. Interrogations were harsh and often violent. Confessions were forced through threats or beatings. Trials, when they happened, were brief and controlled. Some lasted only minutes. Judges followed instructions rather than evidence. In many cases, sentences were decided before the accused even entered the room. Punishments were extreme. Millions were sentenced to forced labor camps for terms that ranged from 5 to 25 years. Others were executed shortly after arrest. Executions were often carried out in secret locations late at night. Families weren't informed of what happened. Official notices, if sent at all, gave vague explanations or false dates. The damage did not stop with the person arrested. Entire families were punished. Wives were labeled as relatives of traitors. Children were taken from their homes and placed in state-run institutions. They were told their parents were enemies of the people. Many children grew up never knowing what really happened, only that their family name carried shame and danger. Transport to the camps was the next stage of suffering. Prisoners were moved in large groups by train. They were packed into freight cars made for animals. There were no seats and almost no sanitation. Journeys could sometimes last weeks. Food was limited to small portions of bread. Water was sometimes unavailable for days. Disease spread quickly in these crowded cars. Many prisoners didn't survive the journey. Some collapsed from hunger or illness before reaching their destination. When trains stopped, guards removed bodies without ceremony. Those still alive were forced onward. Inside the camps, the reality became clear immediately. Guards often came from criminal backgrounds and were given authority over prisoners. This created a violent environment where abuse was common and rarely punished. Beatings were routine. Rules changed without warning. Any mistake could lead to punishment. Food was used as a weapon. Daily rations depended on how much work a prisoner completed. Those who met impossible work targets received slightly more food. Those who failed had their rations cut. Hunger weakened prisoners, making work harder, which led to even less food. This cycle was intentional. It broke people physically and mentally in a short time. The system was not meant to correct behavior. It was meant to crush resistance and remove anyone the state considered risky. By the end of the Great Terror, fear had reached every home. People learned that innocence offered no protection. Survival depended on silence, obedience, and luck. And yet, the outside world still knew almost nothing. In June 1941, when Nazi Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, entire Soviet armies were destroyed in weeks. The war immediately changed everything inside the country, including how the state viewed the people locked inside the gulags. The Soviet government now faced a crisis it had not planned for. It needed soldiers, factory workers, miners, and builders all at once. Every strong body mattered. As a result, some prisoners were reviewed and released, mainly those with military experience or technical skills. They were sent straight from camps to the front lines or war factories. Many were promised reduced sentences, but these promises were often unclear or later ignored. Most prisoners, however, were not released. The state still saw them as disposable. As the war dragged on, conditions inside the gulags became even worse. Food supplies were redirected to the Red Army, which meant camp rations were cut sharply. Bread portions were reduced. Meat almost disappeared. Clothing wore out and was not replaced. Prisoners were expected to keep working at the same pace, even as they grew weaker each day. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded barracks. Medical supplies were scarce or non-existent. Guards focused on production numbers, not survival. In 1942, the situation reached a breaking point. Hunger and illness killed prisoners in huge numbers. In that single year, hundreds of thousands died inside the camps. Some camps lost so many people that work stopped entirely. In remote regions, entire camps were just abandoned. Guards were reassigned to the war effort. Prisoners were left behind with no food, no transport, and no records. In northern areas, snow covered barracks. When spring came, no one returned to recover them. These camps simply disappeared from official reports. The war also created chaos that Stalin could not fully control. As German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, they moved close to areas where camps were located. In the confusion of retreat and counterattack, some camp security collapsed. Guards fled. Records were burned in a hurry. In rare cases, prisoners escaped during bombings or evacuations. Most didn't survive long, but a few managed to reach villages or forests and disappear. When the Red Army began pushing west after 1943, Soviet soldiers encountered Nazi concentration camps for the first time. What they saw shocked them. Emaciated prisoners, mass graves, forced labor sites surrounded by wire. Official Soviet media presented these camps as proof of Nazi evil, and the images deeply affected soldiers and civilians alike. But for many Red Army soldiers, the scenes were painfully familiar. Some had guarded Soviet labor camps before the war. Others had family members who vanished into the Gulag system. The structure, the forced labor, the hunger, and the isolation were not new to them. The difference was not the suffering itself, but who was running the camps and what symbols hung on the gates. The war didn't end the gulags, but it weakened the walls that hid them. And once those walls cracked, the truth had more chances to surface. When Stalin died on March 5, 1953, it removed something that had shaped every decision for years. For the first time in a generation, the people running the country were unsure how far terror should go. Inside the government, panic mixed with relief. Many officials had built their careers by following Stalin's orders. Now they worried those same orders could be turned against them. To protect themselves, they began to distance the system from the worst abuses of the past. Within weeks of Stalin's death, quiet changes began. Arrests slowed. Some investigations were reopened. Committees were formed to review past cases, especially those from the Great Terror years. Files that had been sealed were taken out of storage. In many cases, there was no evidence inside them at all, just accusations and forced confessions. By 1954, thousands of prisoners had been released from labor camps. These releases weren't announced publicly. Trains arrived quietly in towns and villages with people who barely looked alive. Many weighed far less than when they were arrested. Illness was common. Some couldn't work. Others had permanent injuries. Families often didn't recognize them at first. Returning home wasn't simple. Many found their homes taken by others. Jobs were gone. Records still labeled them as enemies. Some were watched by police even after release. Speaking openly about camp life felt dangerous. The turning point came in 1956. Nikita Khrushchev, who had risen to power after Stalin, addressed Communist Party officials in a closed meeting. In this speech, he openly criticized Stalin for using terror, mass arrests, and executions against his own people. He described how false accusations destroyed lives and weakened the country. The speech was meant to stay secret. No recordings were made for the public, but copies were shared and whispered about. Within months, its contents reached beyond party walls. News spread inside the Soviet Union and then outside it. For the first time, a Soviet leader admitted that the terror was real and organized from the top. This moment shattered decades of denial. The idea that millions had been imprisoned without cause was no longer just a rumor or foreign accusation. It came from inside the system itself. While the government didn't fully admit the scale of the camps, it could no longer pretend that they didn't exist. Former prisoners felt the shift immediately. Some began writing letters to officials demanding their names be cleared. Others wrote personal accounts of arrests, interrogations, transport, and camp life. Many of these writings were blocked by censors. Some were confiscated. A few were published in limited form, carefully edited to avoid naming responsible leaders. But the real shock came years later, when physical evidence reached the outside world. It was in the late 1950s and early 60s when many camps had been shut down after Stalin's death. But they weren't properly dismantled. As people began moving again into remote regions, traces of the camps started to appear in the open. Some discoveries happened by accident. Hunters traveling through forests found long rows of collapsing wooden barracks, still surrounded by rusted barbed wire. Railway workers expanding or repairing lines uncovered burial pits along old tracks. In some places, workers broke through frozen ground and found human bones beneath it. Entire settlements appeared on maps that no one officially lived in anymore, yet buildings, guard towers, and fences were still standing. In regions like Kolyma in the far northeast, Vorkuta in the Arctic north, and Norilsk in the polar circle, the full scale of the system became impossible to deny. These weren't isolated camps holding a few hundred prisoners. These were huge industrial complexes that depended entirely on forced labor. Mines, power stations, smelters, and railways stretched for miles. Entire cities existed because prisoners had been forced to build and operate them. Kolyma became known for gold mining under extreme cold. Prisoners worked in temperatures so low that tools froze to bare hands. Vorkuta was built around coal mines in Arctic conditions, where winter darkness lasted for months. Norilsk grew into a major industrial center despite being located in one of the harshest climates on Earth. None of this development would have been possible without mass imprisonment. As researchers, officials, and survivors reached these areas, physical evidence filled the gaps left by missing records. Former prisoners led investigators to execution sites that had been kept secret for years. In frozen ground, bodies were found stacked in layers, preserved by cold. Many were still wearing camp uniforms. Some had numbers sewn onto their clothing instead of names. Tools used for forced labor were recovered. Personal items were found buried near barracks. Camp documents abandoned in storage rooms revealed transport lists, work quotas, and death counts that had never been reported accurately. Piece by piece, a clearer picture began to form. Historians and demographers started calculating the scale. Conservative estimates showed that more than 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1953. Death numbers varied depending on how records were counted, but even the lowest estimates reached over 1.5 million. Some researchers placed the number much higher, closer to 3 million or more. These figures didn't include those executed immediately or those who died shortly after release. The Soviet government responded by trying to limit the damage. Some abandoned camps were destroyed using heavy machinery. Buildings were torn down, burial sites covered over. Records that had survived the war and Stalin's death were quietly removed or destroyed. Access to certain regions was restricted again. But the effort came too late. Too many camps had already been found. Too many witnesses had spoken. Too much physical evidence had surfaced. And by the late 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev, new policies allowed more openness and less control over information. For the first time, foreign journalists were granted access to regions that had been sealed for decades. What they found confirmed what survivors had been saying all along. Cameras captured the remains of the Gulag system exactly as it had been left. Wooden barracks leaned into the ground, half swallowed by frozen soil. Roofs had collapsed, floors had rotted away. Barbed wire fences still stretched across empty land, even though no one guarded them anymore. Watchtowers stood abandoned, their ladders broken, their windows shattered, overlooking nothing but silence. Journalists filmed prison cemeteries scattered near the camps. Instead of headstones, there were wooden stakes pushed into the ground. Most had no names. Many had no markings at all. Rows of graves ran on for long distances, showing how many people had died without being recorded properly. In some places, the ground itself had sunk where mass burials lay beneath the surface. Once released, the footage spread quickly outside the Soviet Union. Television networks aired it across Europe and North America. Viewers who had heard only vague references to labor camps now saw the physical proof. The scale shocked many people. For years, some had believed stories about gulags were exaggerated or used for political attacks. The footage destroyed those doubts. Comparisons to Nazi concentration camps became unavoidable, not because the systems were identical, but because both relied on forced labor, starvation, and mass death. The most difficult truth was the contradiction it revealed. The Soviet Union had played a major role in defeating Nazi Germany, yet this footage showed that at the same time, it had operated its own system of widespread imprisonment and suffering. This was hard for many people to accept, especially those who had believed the Soviet image of moral victory. As Soviet archives slowly opened, the Gulag stopped being just statistics. Names began to appear where numbers once stood. Individual lives came back into view. Teachers arrested in 1937 were listed with reasons that now sounded absurd, such as owning foreign books or teaching ideas that were later labeled dangerous. Engineers were sentenced after factories failed, even when the failures were caused by poor planning from above. Soldiers who survived German prison camps were treated as traitors upon returning home and sent straight into Soviet camps. Entire professions were targeted at different times. Intellectuals, military officers, ethnic minorities, and religious believers all appeared in waves across the files. Children suffered in ways that were rarely discussed for decades. Some were born inside camps. Others were taken there with their parents or placed in nearby settlements run by camp authorities. Many never experienced normal life. Barbed wire and guard towers were part of their daily view. Education was limited or non-existent. Hunger was constant. Disease spread easily among the young, and many did not survive childhood. As more documents surfaced, one fact became impossible to deny. The suffering was not random. Orders were written and signed by officials. Budgets were approved to fund camp construction and transport. Trains were scheduled to move prisoners across thousands of miles. Guard units were assigned. Quotas were enforced. The system ran on paperwork as much as it ran on fear. The discovery of the gulags reshaped how the world understood the Soviet Union. Political movements outside the country were shaken. Communist parties in Europe and elsewhere split apart as members argued over how to respond. Some denied the evidence, others left entirely. Historians were forced to rewrite major parts of 20th century history. The image of progress and industrial success had to be balanced against the human suffering that made it possible. Inside Russia, memory became a source of conflict. Some people pushed for full exposure of the past, believing the truth was necessary to prevent it from happening again. Others resisted, calling the revelations exaggerated or influenced by foreign pressure. Public discussions became tense. Monuments were built to honor victims, then left to decay. Museums opened to document the camps, then struggled to survive as support faded. Despite this, the evidence did not disappear. The footage remained available. The camp ruins still stood across the landscape. Burial grounds remained beneath the soil. No argument could erase what had already been uncovered.